Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. Yeah, I'm here to talk about a book that I just finished reading. I know it might seem a little bit funny and strange that I'll be covering a topic like this, but it's very interesting. And this book is called Street Gang: The Complete History of Sesame Street. Now, the way the title is, you would think Street Gang that it's about gangs, violence, but it's actually about um, the television show Sesame Street, that airs on Channel 13 that everybody knows and loves. And it's more so than just being about Sesame Street. It's about the cultural impact that Sesame Street had on the United States and how Sesame Street came came about in the 1960s. Um, the book first talks about the creators of Sesame Street, Joanne Gans Coney, and her background coming from a social services background, um, and why she decided why her and um, why her and the people at Sesame Street decided to create Sesame Street. Basically, the basic gist of it was the guy um, Lloyd Lloyd Berenson. He saw that his daughter was being mesmerized by the TV, and she was memorizing all the advertisements um, of all the TV shows. And he thought, if we could do this same thing, but instead of just mindless commercials, we could have education and make it entertaining as well. We could we could reach a number of kids that weren't being reached before that. So they decided they shot Sesame Street, the concept of Sesame Street, around to various networks, particularly Fred Silverman, that the network that Fred Silverman was ahead of, which was CBS, and nobody was interested in it. They thought it would be too boring. It would not hold the attention of the kids, the younger demographic. So they faced a very hard time in getting it developed initially, just because they were like, the reaction to it, kids are gonna be bored. You're gonna start teaching them educational stuff, and they're just gonna be bored and just gonna walk away. But they fought for it and fought for it, and it came at a time in 1969 during the civil rights movement, during the popular uprisings that I spoke about before on my channel of people of various races and various economic situations, that it became one of the first shows ever to be so racially inclusive and so gender inclusive, right at the epitome, right at the time when the feminism was on the rise and racial consciousness was on the rise. And that was one of the things that it represented in the new urban America, in post John Kennedy, post Lyndon Johnson America. It represented the new America. For many people, it was the first time that they'd ever seen. For me too, like the first time you ever saw a Hispanic person like Maria, played by Sonia Maranzano's character. The first time you ever saw African Americans in prominent positions on TV that wasn't just all black sitcoms, but it was one of the first, ensemble racially diverse casts ever, and it also include the hearing impaired. It also included the disabled. It made everyone feel like they really belonged on Sesame Street, and it especially the character of Big Bird and the character of Snuffleupagus and the character of Elmo later on impacted um, a lot of young preschoolers' lives and really helped shape a lot of the modern values that we have um, in today's society. So as much as Sesame Street was a result of the cultural impact that existed at the time, it also produced a different cultural impact. And one of the things that the book really touches on is how it highlights two very important episodes. One is the wedding of Luis and played by Emilio Delgado, and Maria's wedding. And the other is the death of Mr. Hooper, and how these two episodes, especially the death of Mr. Hooper, allowed parents to discuss the concept of death with their children. Um, Later on, in other shows like in movies that were tailored for kids, um, the topic of death comes up, like for example in The Lion King. But this was 1982, and the actor who played Mr. Hooper, the store owner, really did die in real life. So the writers were faced with a crisis. Do they represent um, Mr. Hooper with another character and just act like, oh, Mr. Hooper just was the actor Mr. Hooper was just replaced and Mr. Hooper is just a different guy, or do they acknowledge the real life death of this real life, person? And ultimately they acknowledge that he died in real life. So I wasn't alive for this, but I watched the archival footage, and of course, from reading the book, it was a very sad episode, and it was a very, very sad decision that they had to make because, again, like he didn't just die on this. Like in television, people sometimes just die, and they just quit the show, so they write them off as being dead, like John Amos in Good Times. But the guy didn't just die, on the show. He died in real life, so they had to write in that the character, similar to what happened, and I talked about this in my 2010 review video, with the guy from Glee, where he died in real life, so they had to write it in that he died on the show. But the difference with Glee and Sesame Street is that in Sesame Street, you're dealing with really young children that might not be able to grasp the concept of death. So they had to be very sensitive about how they wrote in that storyline. And the other one is um, the marriage of Luis and Maria, which they were married in real life and they were married on the show as well. And the title of the book, it just captures you because it's like, again, you see the word street gang and you're like, oh, a street gang, about gangs. But it's really about this gang of people. Jim Henson was at the helm of it, and Jim Henson's story is covered in this book. Um, his story is very tragic because um, he was diagnosed with I think it was throat cancer, and because of his religion, which was he was a Christian Scientist, it prevented him from going um, to the doctor in time. His religion prohibited medical procedures to be done, and if he'd have gotten there on time, he'd have he'd have survived. But he didn't, so he passed away, and he passed away in 1990, the same day as Sammy Davis Jr. But you know that's also covered in the book, and I just felt like, damn, imagine if Jim Henson had had time to really do something outside of Sesame Street, because what happened when he became famous on Sesame Street is like he became typecast. Like he always was doing the puppeteer thing. He was playing the character of Bert and in the Bert and Ernie, and he was playing the character of Kermit the Frog. He was always doing that kind of puppeteer thing. But when he got um, pigeonholed into this role of just preschool stuff, he couldn't really get out of that and try to take the Muppets in a more mature arena like he wanted to do. So in a certain sense, he was trapped by his success. He wanted to do more innovative things like we saw with the Dark Crystal, Pan's Labyrinth, and it failed because they just wanted to see him do this, you know. So he couldn't really be as creative as he wanted to be, although he did try. And later, the dinosaurs would come out, and the dinosaurs would tackle serious social issues with the use of his Muppets, but he wasn't alive to see it. You know, his plan was to use the vehicle of Sesame Street to catapult him into talking about, real social issues. And unfortunately, because of his early demise, he never really realized that dream. Um, and that to me is the saddest part of it. It's not so much that he died an early death; it's one that his death could have been prevented, and two that he never really achieved his goal of becoming a serious filmmaker and using the arts, using the medium of puppeteering to discuss serious social issues in the way that, let's say, Walt Disney used animation. Jim was never able to do that because he was deaf, and the fact that he lost his voice too, and he was a puppeteer and he was famous for being the voice of Kermit the Frog is kind of sad. It was kind of like I always said about Muhammad Ali, where it's like he's known for talking. So imagine if he can't talk anymore. And that's exactly what happened to Jim Henson. It talks about the discovery of Frank, not really discovery, but Frank Oz's role. We all know Frank Oz is the voice of not only Ernie, but in Bert and Ernie as it pertains to Sesame Street, and but also the voice of Yoda in the Star Wars movies. So Frank Oz is it was crazy because it's like Jim Henson was sort of like Frank Oz's Yoda, and Frank Oz was kind of like the Luke Skywalker. That's how I looked at it. You know what I mean? Like Jim Henson was the teacher of Frank Oz, and Frank Oz later went on to carry on his name later in life. It talks about the legal battles between Jim Henson and uh, Disney, and also PBS, because Jim Henson's family wanted to own um, these Muppets and these characters, but later when Disney later purchased their company, they wanted to take them over, but because these Muppets were public property, they really couldn't, and they're still in litigation today. We're trying to own these properties, but I doubt they will ever own these properties because, as it stands right now, all of Sesame Street is on HBO Max, and Disney Plus cannot purchase the rights to them. Disney Plus is trying to monopolize everything, trying to take over all of children's entertainment, but Jim Henson's family fought and is saying, "Listen, you can have everything else, but you can't have this. You cannot have. You can have like Kermit the Frog. You can have Miss Piggy. You can have, but Sesame Street um, belongs to the people. Belongs to the public. That was the point of Sesame Street. It was a public entity. It was for education and entertainment, and it's not. It wasn't something to be taken lightly. You know, the audio book which I listened to was nominated. Excuse me, narrated by Carol Spinney, who just the year long anniversary of his death was just celebrated not so long ago. He was of course the person behind Big Bird and Oscar the Grouch, and besides Kevin Clash, the voice of Elmo, and Jim Henson himself was probably the most well known voice over character in the Sesame Street family. And it does. And speaking of Elmo, it does talk about Elmo and the rise of Elmo, which coincided with the decline of Sesame Street. Because what happened in the '90s was that other people, like the creators of Barney, took the formula that Sesame Street had created, and they did it. They did the same thing Sesame Street did, but they did it better than Sesame Street. You know, um, why I say this is brought to you by the letter J. Of course, it's a play on words because my nickname is Jay, and also because a lot of the influential people uh, that were part of Sesame Street, their names started with the letter J. Jim Henson, Joe Raposo, who wrote the song, who Joe Raposo's death was like around the same time as Jim Henson, like a week or so before. Jim Henson had actually did um, a tribute to Joe Raposo. Again, the guy who wrote the song "Sunny Days." That's the intro to Sesame Street. Um, and of course, Joanne Gans Comey was another influential figure in the creation of Sesame Street. This book follows the lives of these creators and what really motivated them, especially um, Lloyd Barrett and and um, Joanne Gansconi and Jim Henson. What and John Stone. What really and Joe Raposo. What really motivated them to want to create this show. And what really motivated them was wanting to create this show was, to me, a desire for racial justice and a desire to Because they realized if you educate kids on things like multiculturalism, like hearing impaired culture, like disability culture, at an early age, it will decrease their level of ignorance about these sort of things. And that's what I always loved about Sesame Street was that when I was little, you never really saw, people that were disabled on TV except for on Sesame Street. You know, they would bring people with disabilities on the Sesame Street to interact with Big Bird, to interact with Grover, to interact with um, Ernie, and it was just cool, and it was just the most inclusive that TV got, in the early days, especially from the '60s to the 1980s. And to me, it was a better show than Barney. Whereas Barney, and it talks about this in the book, whereas Barney dealt with like a more suburban, a more a less a more suburban, more upper class lifestyle. Sesame Street really dealt, even in its aesthetics, with the more gritty, more urban type lifestyle. And that's what this book really hits on, and that's really what the title is talking about. It's like a double entendre because it this gang of people really did create this all-inclusive street in an ironic way. But anyway, I say this book is by Michael Davis. It was published in 2008, and it's a really great read if you're interested in not only the history of television as far as entertainment, but the history of social activism on television and the use of a medium like television to not only entertain but educate as well. So peace.